boy moves through the gates of Fort Michilimackinac, searching. 10 years old, maybe 11, his grandmother sent him to find the British colours, the flag that flew over the commander's quarters this morning. His moccasins leave prints in mud that wasn't mud an hour ago, earth darkened with something warmer than rain. The June sun blazes overhead, but shadows pool beneath the wooden walls. Flies have already found the grim scene. They rise in clouds as he passes, settling again on shapes that were men this morning. The boy doesn't look at their faces. He has a task. He keeps his eyes moving, scanning for red fabric, for the symbol of an authority that no longer exists here. He checks the guardhouse first. The door hangs open. Inside, a chair overturned, playing cards scattered like fallen leaves, a British coat draped over a bench, but no flag. The air tastes of copper and black powder. Through the window, smoke still drifts from the commander's quarters, carrying the smell of burning paper, burning wood. The boy crosses the parade ground, stepping around outstretched arms, around muskets that will never fire. Through the haze, he can see women moving with purpose, gathering what can be gathered, taking what must be taken. His mother among them, filling a basket with powder horns. Their hands work quickly, efficiently. They don't speak. This is not looting. This is reclamation. Near the flagpole, he finds what he seeks. The British colours lie trampled in the dirt, the Union flag torn but recognisable. He gathers the fabric carefully, folding it as his grandmother taught him to fold trade blankets, with respect for what it represents, even in defeat. A broken lacrosse stick lies behind the flag, the shaft snapped clean in half, the netted pocket torn. Hours ago, it was an instrument of sport. Minutes ago, something else entirely. Now just splinters on packed earth. The boy picks up half of it, turns it in his hand, then lets it fall. Outside the walls, he can hear voices calling in Ojibwe, organising, planning. The work isn't finished. Canoes are being loaded, prisoners secured. But here, inside the walls where British soldiers woke this morning believing themselves masters of the straits, there is only stillness. The kind that comes after thunder, after the storm has passed, but the air still trembles with its memory. The boy clutches the folded flag and makes his way back toward the gate. His grandmother will want to see this, proof that the morning work is done, that the fort has changed hands. In one afternoon, in the time it takes to play a game, the world has shifted on its axis. But this is not an isolated tremor. Across thousands of miles of forest and river, similar scenes are unfolding, or soon will. The French are gone, their empire in America dead. The British have inherited their forts but not their understanding, and in that gap between possession and comprehension, indigenous nations are making their move. How did a game become a weapon? What force could unite such diverse nations in a simultaneous action across an impossible distance? And when the smoke clears and the blood dries, what will this moment mean for the fate of a continent balanced on the edge of revolutionary change? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is Pontiac's Rebellion. The fort at Michilimackinac had changed hands in a single afternoon, but the forces that made such coordinated uprising possible had been building for 3 years. To understand how a lacrosse game became a weapon, how diverse nations united across impossible distances, we must return to September 1760, when Montreal fell and New France died. It happened not with the drama of siege guns or burning cities, but with the scratch of a quill on parchment. The French governor signed away an empire that had stretched from the mouth of the St. Lawrence to the mouth of the Mississippi, and with that signature, the world shifted for every indigenous nation that had built their existence around French trade, French gifts, and French military alliance. The British came to the forts of the Pays d'Onan, that upper country of lakes and rivers, like inheritors walking through an unfamiliar house. A dozen posts scattered like beads on the thread of waterways that connected the Atlantic to the heart of the continent. The British officers who took command of these posts understood their strategic value. What they failed to grasp was their diplomatic architecture, the complex web of relationships that made them function. The empire that claimed these victories was drunk on triumph but bleeding money. The 7 Years' War had been fought on 5 continents, the first truly global conflict. British armies had conquered French Canada, British fleets had seized French Caribbean islands, British forces had defeated French allies in India. From London's perspective, Britain now stood as the undisputed masters of the sea and much of the world's trade. But mastery came with a bill that threatened to bankrupt the nation. The war had doubled Britain's national debt to a staggering £140 million. The annual interest alone consumed most of the government's revenue. Every fort in the American interior, every soldier stationed there, every gift distributed to Indigenous allies meant more expenses the Treasury could not afford. The empire had never been larger, never been more powerful, and never been more fragile. What looked like strength from London looked like overextension from the ground, where a few hundred British soldiers attempted to control a continental interior they barely understood. For generations, the French had governed through gifts, not charity, but diplomacy conducted through material exchange. Annual distributions of gunpowder, blankets, tools and tobacco that affirmed alliances and acknowledged Indigenous sovereignty. The French commanders had understood themselves as fathers in a kinship network, not masters of conquered territory. They had married into Indigenous families, learned Indigenous languages, adapted to Indigenous protocols. When Ottawa leaders came to Fort Detroit, they expected to smoke together, to exchange speeches that could last for days, to receive the gifts that sealed friendships and confirmed mutual obligations. General Geoffrey Amherst, British Commander-in-Chief in North America, viewed such practices as expensive nonsense, a veteran of European wars where victory meant submission. Amherst saw no need to purchase the cooperation of people he considered already defeated. In his dispatches to fort commanders in 1761, his contempt crystallized into policy: end the gift-giving, restrict the gunpowder trade to the absolute minimum needed for hunting, prohibit the repair of French-made firearms, treat the Indigenous people not as allies to be courted but as conquered subjects to be controlled. The British officers who implemented these orders couldn't understand why their forts began to feel like islands, why the visiting delegations grew smaller, then stopped coming altogether, why the intelligence that had once flowed freely about French sympathisers and Spanish ambitions dried to nothing. They stood on their ramparts, watching the tree line, and told themselves that silence meant submission. In the Muskingum Valley, a Delaware prophet named Neolin began preaching a different interpretation. In visions, the Master of Life had shown him a map of the cosmos, the earth, the paradise meant for Indigenous souls, and the separate realm where Europeans belonged. The paths had become tangled. Indigenous people had forgotten their own routes to paradise, following instead the crooked roads of European trade, European goods, and European ways of being. Neolin's solution was radical severance. Abandon European cloth for deerskin, European tools for traditional implements, European alcohol entirely. Most critically, reduce dependence on European gunpowder by returning to bows and arrows. This was not mere nostalgia, but strategic preparation. A people who could feed and defend themselves without European supply chains could resist European control. The prophet's message spread through the Ohio country and the Great Lakes like water finding every crack in stone. It reached Detroit in the winter of 1762 to 1763, carried by Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi hunters who had heard Neolin speak. There it found fertile ground in the mind of an Ottawa leader named Pontiac. History would later paint Pontiac as the singular architect of what followed, the commanding general of a grand Indigenous confederacy. The reality was both more modest and more remarkable. Pontiac was one voice in a council of many, one leader among dozens who were reaching similar conclusions independently. His power lay not in hierarchical command, but in his ability to articulate what many already felt, that the British presence had become intolerable, that the moment to act was narrowing, that indigenous nations could reclaim their sovereignty through coordinated resistance. Through the early months of 1763, messages moved along the water routes and forest paths. War belts, wampum strings painted red, passed from village to village. Not orders from a supreme commander, but invitations to consensus. Each nation would act according to its own judgment, against its own local targets, but they would act simultaneously. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. No massive armies marching in formation, no supply chains or artillery batteries. Instead, each fort would face the warriors who knew it best, who had traded there, whose families had camped outside its walls. Local knowledge applied to local targets, but coordinated across impossible distances through networks of kinship and alliance that predated European presence by centuries. As spring arrived in 1763, British commanders noticed increasing indigenous traffic around their posts, but interpreted it as normal seasonal movement. Warriors gathered for summer hunts, families arriving for spring trading. At Fort Pitt, they reinforced their gates as a precaution, but expected nothing more than petty theft. At Detroit, they received vague warnings from French inhabitants about indigenous discontent, but dismissed them as attempts to undermine British authority. The British Empire in 1763 controlled more of North America than any European power ever had. From Hudson Bay to the Florida Keys, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, the Union flag flew over an unprecedented expanse. Yet that empire's reach into the continental interior consisted of a few dozen wooden forts, none holding more than 100 soldiers, most far fewer. Islands of claimed authority in an indigenous sea that was beginning to rise. What the British would call Pontiac's Rebellion, though Pontiac never started it nor controlled it, began in May 1763. Within weeks, the uprising would consume the entire frontier. Of the 14 British posts west of the Appalachians, 8 would fall immediately. Detroit would endure a 5-month siege. Fort Pitt would survive by methods that would stain British honour, distributing smallpox-infected blankets to besieging warriors. Hundreds of British soldiers would die. Thousands of colonial settlers would flee eastward or perish on isolated farmsteads. The British response would reveal the Empire's fundamental misunderstanding of the geography it claimed to rule. Amherst would order punitive expeditions that would bog down in endless forest. He would rage against savages who refused to fight proper European battles. He would demand unconditional submission from nations who had never considered themselves British subjects to begin with. By October 1763, as the uprising raged with no end in sight, the British Crown would issue a document meant to restore stability, the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This edict would establish a boundary along the Appalachian Ridge, prohibiting colonial settlement west of the mountains, recognising indigenous ownership of the interior. The British government presented this as wise policy, a cooling measure to prevent further bloodshed. But it was also an admission of reality. The empire that claimed dominion from sea to sea could not actually control the lands between. The proclamation would fail to end the fighting, which would continue in fragments through 1764 and beyond. It would also fail to stop colonial expansion, as settlers ignored the boundary line and pushed into indigenous territories regardless of imperial edicts. But it would succeed in alienating the American colonists, who saw it as tyrannical restriction on their natural right to indigenous lands. The seeds of one revolution were being planted in the soil of another. All of this, the fall of New France, Amherst's policies, Nealon's prophecies, the coordinated uprising, the proclamation and its failures, created the context for what would happen at Fort Michilimackinac on the 2nd of June 1763. Not an isolated incident, but one movement in a larger symphony of resistance. The lacrosse game that would turn lethal was not a clever trick played on unsuspecting soldiers. It was strategy adapted from culture, tradition weaponized by necessity. sport transformed into war by a people who understood that their moment to act was now or never. Fort Michilimackinac stood where the waters narrowed, where Lake Michigan met Lake Huron through the tight passage the French called the Straits of Mackinac. To control this strait was to control the movement of furs from the Western Territories, the flow of trade goods into the interior, and the very pulse of commerce that kept the upper country alive. The fort itself was modest by European standards, a wooden palisade forming a square, perhaps 200 feet on each side, cedar posts driven into sandy soil, sharpened at the top, barely 20 feet high. Inside, a collection of wooden buildings arranged around a central parade ground, barracks for the garrison, officers' quarters, storehouses for trade goods, a powder magazine, and a chapel that served both Catholic habitants and Protestant soldiers. Along the eastern wall, smaller structures housed the French families who had remained after the conquest, traders and their wives, interpreters, men who knew the fur business in ways the British never would. These families occupied a liminal space, neither conquered nor conquerors, essential to the fort's function but never fully trusted by its commanders. The British flag flew from a pole in the centre, visible to every canoe that passed through the strait. By June 1763, Captain George Etherington commanded a garrison of 35 soldiers here, young men mostly, recruited from England's poor, Ireland's desperate, Scotland's dispossessed. They had expected military glory, perhaps, or at least regular pay. Instead, they found themselves on the edge of the world that they knew, surrounded by forests that seemed to go on forever, dependent on supply ships that came irregularly at best. They drilled on the parade ground, stood watch at the walls, and tried to maintain military discipline in a place where that concept seemed increasingly abstract. The British might command the garrison, but they were strangers in a social world they could barely comprehend. Lacrosse games were part of that world. To the Ojibwe, the creators' game was more than entertainment. It was diplomacy, ceremony, training for war, and cosmic ritual all at once. Games between villages could involve hundreds of players and last for days. The field might stretch for a mile. The stakes could include trade agreements, territorial disputes, or simple honour. British soldiers had watched these games with fascination and incomprehension, seeing chaos where there was actually sophisticated strategy, violence when there was controlled aggression. Captain Etherington had watched several games since taking command. He found them thrilling in their intensity, though he could never quite follow the action. When Ojibwe leaders proposed a game for the 2nd of June to celebrate the birthday of King George III, Etherington saw it as a sign of improving relations. The Indigenous were finally showing proper respect for British authority. He approved immediately. Morning breaks clear over the straits. June the 2nd, 1763. The sun climbs early at this latitude in summer, turning the water into hammered silver. Inside Fort Michilimackinac, soldiers move through morning routines made sluggish by unexpected heat. The temperature is already climbing past what anyone expected this early in the season. Captain Etherington emerges from his quarters, uniform adjusted despite the warmth. He has correspondence to finish, reports about trade volumes and Indigenous movements that Montreal expects monthly. But the scratching of quills can wait. Today is celebration. Today he has told his men they can relax their usual vigilance. The Ojibwe arrive before noon. Warriors mainly, young men painted for the game in designs that mean nothing to British eyes, but everything to those who could read them. Red ochre for war, black charcoal for death, hidden in patterns the British see as mere decoration. They carry their lacrosse sticks, 3-foot lengths of hickory with netted pockets made from deer sinew. Some joke with each other in Ojibwe, their laughter carrying across the parade ground. Others stretch, preparing muscles for what's to come. Behind the warriors come women, grandmothers and mothers, sisters and wives, wrapped in heavy blankets despite the heat. They enter the fort casually, as they have many times before, finding spots along the walls where they can watch the game. The soldiers barely notice them. Indigenous women are part of the landscape here, as unremarkable as trees or stones. Some soldiers even smile at them, attempting gallantry. The women smile back, pulling their blankets tighter. Sword warriors arrive from the south of the strait. They will be the opposing team. Though the British don't understand that this opposition is performance, that these traditional enemies have been meeting in councils for weeks, that this game has been choreographed as carefully as any European ballet. Among them are warriors who have fought the Ojibwe in genuine conflicts, who know exactly how to make this performance believable. Etherington orders the gates left open. How else will they watch the game, which will take place on the field outside? Besides, what threat could there be? The Indigenous are here to celebrate British rule. His soldiers stack their muskets in the guardhouse, unbutton their coats, find good vantage points along the walls. Some bring out playing cards, others produce pipes. Lieutenant William Leslie warns that they should maintain some guard, but Etherington waves him off. Let the men enjoy themselves. God knows there's little enough entertainment in this wilderness. The teams gather on the field, 40 players on each side, perhaps more. They face each other across a space that stretches from the fort's gates to the tree line, several hundred yards of trampled grass and sand. An elder holds the wooden bull, no bigger than a child's fist, carved from hard maple. He speaks words in Ojibwe that the British cannot understand. Words about the Creator's gain, about honour and strength, about what is to come. Then he hurls the bull high into the air. The game explodes into motion. Bodies collide with the crack of flesh on flesh. Lacrosse sticks clash like wooden swords. The bull disappears into a scrum of warriors, then suddenly arcs high against the blue sky, pursued by running figures whose speed seems impossible. From the walls, British soldiers cheer without understanding what they're cheering for. They see patterns that aren't there, miss ones that are. To them, it's beautiful chaos. 80 warriors in full sprint, wheeling and striking. The bull flying back and forth across the field like a musket shot. They don't notice how the action gradually shifts towards the fort, how certain players consistently drive the ball not towards designated goals, but towards the open gates. The women against the walls stand slowly, adjusting their blankets. One soldier, Private Morrison, notices something odd about the way that they're clutching the heavy wool. Strange to wear such thick blankets in this heat. He steps closer to an elderly woman, gestures at her blanket, miming she must be too warm. She smiles at him, a grandmother's smile, and loosens her grip slightly. The blanket falls open, just enough. Morrison sees iron, the black edge of a tomahawk blade. His eyes widen. He opens his mouth to shout a warning. But in that moment, the bull sails over his head directly through the fort's entrance. The action pauses. Players look at each other as if confused. Should they follow? Is the game still on? Morrison is still staring at the woman, his warning stuck in his throat, his mind trying to reconcile what he's seeing with what's possible. Then they move, not in the chaotic rush of sport, but with sudden purpose. Warriors pour through the gates, no longer playing, no longer pretending. The woman Morrison had approached throws off her blanket entirely, pressing the tomahawk into a warrior's hands as he passes. Other women along the walls are doing the same, blankets falling like autumn leaves, revealing weapons that pass from hidden to active in one fluid motion. Morrison finally finds his voice, but his warning is lost in the war cries that now fill the parade ground. He reaches for his sword, but he's not wearing it. None of them are. This was supposed to be a celebration. The grandmother who had smiled at him moments ago watches impassively as a warrior's club catches Morrison at the base of his skull. He drops without a sound. His last thought, not of home or God, but simply confusion. How had he not understood? His body falls across the threshold between the parade ground and the wall, half in sunshine, half in shadow. A soldier near the guardhouse sees the first tomahawk rise and fall. He has time to scream once before the blade finds his skull with a sickening crunch. The sound of his death, wet, final, carries across the parade ground, and suddenly everyone understands. Soldiers stumble over each other as they scramble for the guardhouse where their muskets wait. But warriors are already there, already between them and their weapons. The Sauk warriors, who moments ago were opponents in the game, now work in perfect coordination with the Ojibwe, cutting off escape routes, herding soldiers toward the centre of the parade ground where resistance becomes impossible. Lieutenant Leslie tries to organise resistance, shouting orders that disappear into the rising chaos. He manages to draw his sword, even parries a tomahawk strike, before a Sauk warrior's knife finds his rib from behind. He drops to his knees, staring at the blood spreading across his waistcoat. Captain Etherington runs from his quarters, pistol in hand. He manages one shot, wild, hitting nothing, before 3 Ojibwe warriors tackle him to the ground. They don't kill him. He's worth more alive, worth ransom or leverage. They bind his hands with rawhide strips and drag him towards the gate while he's still shouting commands to soldiers who are already dead or dying. The French habitants have barricaded themselves in their houses. They knew. Of course they knew. Charles Langlade, the French Ojibwe trader, had warned them last night to keep their doors locked, their children inside, to wait for the storm to pass. Now they peer through shuttered windows as the fort they once commanded changes hands again. The powder magazine is secured within minutes. The storehouses are open, trade goods spilling onto the ground, blankets, kettles, knives, everything the British had restricted, now freely taken. Smoke begins to rise from the officers' quarters as papers burn, maps and correspondence and careful reports about Indigenous movements that proved worthlessly wrong. Some soldiers make it to the walls, trying to climb, to escape, to find any way out of the tightening trap. Sauk and Ojibwe soldiers pull them down, efficient as wolves. Others surrender, throwing down swords they never had a chance to draw, raising hands in gestures of submission that might have meant something in European warfare, but here they only delay the inevitable. Within 20 minutes, perhaps less, Fort Michilimackinac belongs to the Ojibwe again. At least 20 soldiers lie dead in the parade ground, their blood soaking into sand. The exact count would never be certain, British records confused by the chaos. Indigenous accounts measuring victory differently than European chroniclers. Others are captured, bound, assembled for transport. The British Empire's control of the strategic straits has ended in less time it takes to play a proper game of cricket. By afternoon, canoes had arrived from the mainland. Warriors who had waited in the forest, watching for the signal of smoke rising from the fort. They brought rope for prisoners, bags for plunder, and most importantly, news from other forts. Fort Sandusky had fallen 5 days earlier. Fort St. Joseph burned the same day. Miami was taken. Ouiatenon surrendered. Across the Pays du Nord, British power was collapsing like a house of cards in the wind. The prisoners were divided according to complex Indigenous protocols that British military codes could never comprehend. Some would be adopted into families that had lost warriors in the French wars. Not enslaved, but transformed. Given new names, new kinship ties, new lives. Private John Stevens from Manchester would become the son of an Ojibwe mother who had lost her own son at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. He would learn to set traps, to read weather in cloud formations, to speak Ojibwe with the accent of the Northern Lakes. Others faced different fates. The wounded who couldn't travel were killed quickly, mercy by Indigenous standards, though the British would call it a massacre. Those who could bring ransom were sorted by perceived value. Officers like Captain Etherington were taken to where Odawa councils would spend days debating their worth in trade goods versus their value as political leverage. Some prisoners were claimed by individual warriors as prizes of war. Their treatment would depend entirely on their captor's disposition. Some would be tortured according to rituals the British found incomprehensible, but which served specific functions in Indigenous concepts of grief, power, and spiritual balance. Others would be treated with unexpected kindness, incorporated into daily life, taught skills, even allowed to marry into the community. The Sauk warriors took their share of plunder and prisoners and departed before sunset, their part in the elaborate deception complete. They had old conflicts with the Ojibwe that would resume once this shared purpose ended, but for this one day, Traditional enemies had united against a common threat that superseded ancient grievances. The fort itself was not destroyed. That had never been the intention. This was about reclamation, not annihilation. The Ojibwe had traded at this place before the British came, before the French had even arrived, and they would trade here after both empires were memory. The wooden walls could stay, the buildings could be useful, only the flag needed changing, and that had already been accomplished by a boy's grandmother, who wanted the British colours as proof of victory. Within 3 days, word of Michilimackinac fall reached Detroit, where Pontiac's siege was already tightening around Major Gladwin's garrison. The news travelled down the lakes to Niagara, where British commanders began to understand that this was not a local uprising, but a continental convulsion. It reached Montreal, where General Amherst raged about savagery and treachery, unable to comprehend that his policies had created the very resistance he now faced. The lacrosse game at Michilimackinac would enter history as a clever trick, a deception that fooled naive British soldiers. But this diminishes what actually happened. The Ojibwe had not hidden their game. They had announced it, celebrated it, made it the centre of attention. They had used British assumptions that Indigenous peoples were childlike, that their sports were mere entertainment. The British assumed that Indigenous peoples were childlike, that their sports were mere entertainment, and their women were harmless. The Ojibwe used this ignorance as a weapon, more effective than muskets. They had taken a sacred practice, the Creator's game, and transformed it into an instrument of liberation without defiling its essence. This was not trickery, this was strategy born from cultural strength, resistance that emerged from the very traditions that the British had dismissed as primitive. The game had always been preparation for war, and on June 2nd, 1763, it simply became war itself. By July 1763, only Detroit, Fort Pitt, and Niagara still flew the Union flag. The uprising had succeeded everywhere except where it mattered the most. Detroit was meant to fall first. Pontiac planned to take the fort controlling the strait between Lakes Erie and Huron through deception, just as would later succeed elsewhere. On May the 7th, nearly a month before Michilimackinac fall, Pontiac entered Detroit with 60 warriors, tomahawks hidden beneath blankets. But Major Henry Gladwin, warned by an informant whose identity remains unknown, had his men armed and ready. The trap had reversed. Pontiac withdrew and turned to a strategy Europeans believed Indigenous warfare could not sustain: siege. For 5 months, Detroit became a different kind of battlefield. Pontiac's coalition of Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi warriors surrounded the fort with disciplined patience. They dug entrenchments that shocked British officers, intercepted supply ships, and sent captured vessels drifting as fire ships towards the fort. They endured heat, rain, hunger, and the onset of autumn. Inside the walls, 300 soldiers and civilians rationed powder by the grain and flour by the handful. They ate horses, then thin soup. Children cried from hunger while sentries learned not to show their heads above the ramparts. Detroit became a prison, its walls both protection and confinement. The contrast with Michilimackinac was stark. There, cultural knowledge turned ceremony into strategy. At Detroit, European fortification held. Barely. Pontiac adapted, proving Indigenous forces could conduct extended operations, but siege required unity, time, and resources. As weeks became months, old rivalries resurfaced. Disputes over supplies and hunting grounds fractured the coalition. Some warriors left to harvest corn. Others departed when British expeditions approached. The French habitants, who had whispered of aid from King Louis, grew uneasy when no French soldiers appeared. By October, winter made the truth unavoidable. Detroit would not fall. Yet British power extended no further than fort walls. Relief expeditions were ambushed by warriors who refused European conventions of war. At Bushy Run, Colonel Henry Bouquet survived only by abandoning traditional tactics and feigning retreat. By autumn 1763, both sides were exhausted. Indigenous nations had erased British presence from most of the interior, but failed to take the great forts. The British held those forts but dared not leave them. In London, the cost was calculated. Holding the frontier would require 10,000 soldiers permanently stationed, an impossible expense. The Royal Proclamation of October 1763 drew a line along the Appalachians, declaring lands west Indigenous territory. It was retreat disguised as policy. The proclamation satisfied no one. Indigenous leaders saw it as meaningless paper. Colonists saw betrayal. George Washington dismissed it as temporary. Land-hungry settlers crossed the Appalachians anyway. Another grievance joined the growing list pushing the colonies towards rebellion. Through 1764 and 1765, the war fragmented. William Johnson, the British Indian superintendent who had spent decades building relationships with the indigenous nations, worked desperately for peace and reinstated gift-giving as negotiated uneasy truces. Pontiac himself held out until July 1766, when he met Johnson and buried the hatchet in a ceremony both knew signified exhaustion, not peace. The core conflict, indigenous sovereignty versus settler expansion, remained unresolved. Amherst was recalled in disgrace. His replacement, Thomas Gage, reversed policy, treating indigenous nations as powers to negotiate with rather than subjects to control. Too late to prevent the war, perhaps just in time to prevent its immediate return. The transformation begun at Michilimackinac was complete. Britain claimed dominion from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, but in reality held only scattered forts in an indigenous world that had tested empire and found it wanting. Ceremony had become strategy, tradition had become resistance. Return to Fort Michilimackinac. The field lies quiet now, the fort a tourist site where postcards commemorate a lacrosse game. But something irreversible happened there in June 1763. A boy who retrieved the British flag would grow old telling how warriors turned sport into war and how an empire revealed itself as hollow, enforceable only as far as muskets could fire. This is the legacy of Pontiac's Rebellion. It did not expel Europeans, but it proved conquest was not submission, and claims of dominion were not control. Indigenous nations showed that they could unite, adapt, and resist. For 20 minutes on a summer afternoon, they demonstrated what was possible when the colonized refused to perform obedience, and proved that the world, however briefly, could be changed. Well then, there you have it. If you've listened this far and like what you've heard, consider liking and subscribing. Also hit that notification bell to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, it helps so much, not only in pushing these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but also reassures me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then, what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.